Welcome to episode 223 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at 7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/223. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel, and today it is my annual roundup show where I talk about my favorite books and documentaries and podcasts and music from the last year, so from 2020. And this is the 6th time of me doing this. So if you want to see what I've consumed in previous years, I'll link to all of those other shows in the show notes. And I will do the same for each of the categories for this year. So for the books, I will list all of the books that I read this year, and then obviously go through the ones that I go through today, and I'll do the same for the documentaries and the podcasts, etc. So let's start with the books. And this year I read 23 books in total. As always happens, I will discover some other book or multiple books that I forgot to add to the list, but at this time it's 23 that I can remember. And 3 of them are fiction. And I think last year I didn't read any fiction, and I said that I wanted to start including some of that again back in my reading. So that happened on 3 occasions this time. And I'm going to go through now 6 of the books. And so these are sort of my 6 favorites for the year. So my first one is called This Book Will Save Your Life by A.M. Holmes. And so this is fiction. The title is terrible in comparison to actually what the book is about. So it's about a father having a midlife crisis, and he's trying to reconnect with his son and sort of find out what makes him happy and living in LA. And I really enjoyed it because it was just such a page turner, and it was a really easy read and just immediately sucked in from page 1. I think often with fiction, there is a point where you've just got to persevere to start with to then kind of really get into it. And with this, there was none of that the whole time. It was really engaging, and it was just a really easy read. It had actually been sitting on my shelf for a number of years. I can't remember where I bought it or when I bought it, but I had a decision this year to really scale back buying books because I have so many books on my bookshelf that I haven't read. And yeah, at some point I was just looking through and I picked this up, and it was really great. It was really, really enjoyable. And I now want to go and check out more books by this author. So if you're looking for some fiction that is very easy to read, then I would recommend this. It's called This Book Will Save Your Life by A.M. Holmes. The next book was The Fifth Risk, Undoing Democracy by Michael Lewis. So I'm a big fan of Michael Lewis. I included one of his books last year on my list called The Undoing Project, which was about Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. He is also the writer. He wrote Moneyball, he wrote The Big Short, both of which have been turned into films. And I actually read this at the very start of the year, so the very start of 2020. I bought it in an airport on the way to Australia. And what he talks about in that book has become very, very relevant now. So it looked at the problems in government for kind of 2 areas, and this is looking at the US and the problems where institutions within government are gutted, and that government becomes smaller and smaller, and things that people don't really understand how important they are get cut. And he also talks about the importance of the transition period. And so from going from one government to the next government, and talked a lot about how grateful Obama was to George W. Bush in that he got such a great transition. So when Obama was elected and there's this transition period of 6 weeks or 2 months, George W. Bush just put everyone on it and gave him a really smooth transition into government. And then when Obama was going out of government, he wanted to do the exact same thing. And he wanted to give Trump a really smooth transition into the White House, and that they set up these transition teams. And on day one, they're expecting all of these people to turn up, and no one turned up. And then kind of weeks went by where no one was turning up. And then with a couple of days to go, one person would turn up for a meeting for 3 hours, and then they would go. And that was kind of it. And he just talked about how devastating that can be in terms of starting the new cycle as a government. And so it's very interesting now to see how all of this is playing out with the Trump government at the moment. And so, yeah, I thought it was a really well-written book. It was pretty alarming in many ways. But yeah, Michael Lewis has a really great writing style. It's very easy to read. It's a pretty short book in the whole scheme of things. But it's pretty accurate how much of what he was talking about is now coming to fruition. So that is The Fifth Risk, Undoing Democracy by Michael Lewis. The next book is called It Wasn't Your Fault by Beverly Engel. And this was actually recommended to me by a client of mine. And as part of the work that we were doing together, she decided that she wanted to start working on the fact that she had been abused as a child. And she was working with, or started to work with a therapist, and they recommended a number of books. And this was one of the books that they recommended to her. And it's about compassion and self-compassion, but with the focus being for those who have suffered childhood abuse of some kind, whether that be physical or mental or sexual, and looking at sort of why someone who has had that experience or experiences in childhood can have such a difficult time with compassion and self-compassion. And Beverly Engel is a therapist and someone who has suffered many of these abuses herself growing up. So a lot of this has come from her own healing, but also working as a counselor or a therapist for many decades. This is something she's done in private practice as well. So for me, I just found that it's been a really great book for bridging the gap, because I am such a big proponent of self-compassion, and think it is really integral to so much of the work that I do. If you listen to the podcast I did with Josie Geller, we actually talk a lot about this and how if self-compassion is not there, some of how that can be a roadblock to healing from eating disorders. And it's not just eating disorders that it can be a roadblock from, it can be for many different reasons. And so this book was great in talking about like why self-compassion is important, which I already knew, but in terms of why it can then be so difficult for someone who has had such a traumatic start to life, can struggle with putting that into practice. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. Enjoyed it's probably the wrong word, because it is quite a tough book, and there's sort of definitely some upsetting parts, but it is very practical. It is very helpful. I have recommended it to a number of clients this year, and I've actually reached out to Beverly, and she's going to be on the podcast in the early part of 2021. So that is called It Wasn't Your Fault by Beverly Engel. The next book is More Than a Body by Lindsay and Lexi Kite. So this is probably one that's more familiar if you're a regular listener. I've just released a podcast with Lindsay talking all about this book. So it's looking at body image and body resilience, or body image resilience, and how you can learn to see your body as an instrument for living and helping you navigate in this world and getting enjoyment and happiness and all of those things, instead of it just being an ornament for objectification and self-objectification. And yeah, there's a lot that we dig into as part of the recent podcast. We talk about self-objectification. We talk about sort of health and fitness and how the problems that are caused because of the mainstream media and the way that it's looked at. We look at the belief that people will be happier when they're thinner, and how misguided this can be, and the process by which you can change this. But yeah, there's a lot in that podcast, and it will give you a good taste for the book. But yeah, this is something that I'm definitely going to be recommending a lot with clients. It's only just been released. I think it was released on Christmas Day or the day after. And so now that it's out, I will be recommending to clients and getting them to use it regularly. So that is the book called More Than a Body by Lindsay and Lexi Kite. The next book is called Little Girls in Pretty Boxes by Joan Ryan. And this is another book that I'd had sitting on my shelf from a very long time ago. I'm not sure when I bought this, but it had sat on my bookshelf for a while, and I kind of pulled it out this year. And it's actually a pretty old book. It was released in '95. I was reading it, and early on in the book, she makes reference to the fact that Boris Becker recently won some tennis tournament. And I was like, hang on a second, Boris Becker has not been playing tennis for a very long time. So I checked the front of the book, and I was like, okay, this was released in 1995. And so the book is about, it focuses on gymnastics and focuses on figure skating and the pressure that is put on these very young girls who participate in these sports, and the injuries and the eating disorders and the abuse that has gone on. And it looks at, with each of these, it goes through different participants and talks about their stories. And despite being written 25 years ago, in some ways, or in many ways, very little has changed. And this year I watched the documentary on Netflix called Cheer, which is all about cheerleading and a particular school that has been winning all of these cheerleading competitions. But it was pretty difficult to watch because you're just seeing these young kids with broken bodies and training with injuries and trying to weigh less. And you just see really how disposable these kids are in terms of wanting to win some tournament and just being pushed beyond what should really be happening for a healthy body. And whereas with other sports, in terms of, basketball or NFL, there could be someone who pushes themselves because they're likely to have a career in this. And so there is something that could be potentially riding on it in terms of them making a large income and that then being their life. But with this, after they finish college, there is no more of the kind of cheerleading that they're doing. And so this is something they're doing at a very young age that is probably going to have an impact on them for the rest of their life in a pretty negative way, or likely in a negative way. And so, yeah, it seemed to match up very much with what was talked about in the book. I also listened to a podcast called Believe, which was all about Larry Nassar, the US gymnastics team national doctor, who is now in jail for abusing girls over a period of decades. And yeah, this is also talked about as part of the book. So despite the book being quite an old book, it's rather sad to see that nothing has changed. And I've done podcasts also on Red S and how, so relative energy deficiency in sport, and how that affects all of the different systems within the body. And this book, again, when talking to all of the different interviewees, really highlights all of the different aspects of Red S. So yeah, definitely not an uplifting book by any means, but really gave a pretty eye-opening state of affairs for both of these sports in terms of figure skating and gymnastics, and I would imagine that it's much broader than that. The next book is Shadow Daughter, and this is by Harriet Brown. And this is a book that is all about family estrangement. So family relationships can often be fraught with difficulties, and for many people it reaches the point that it's better to them to not have that person or persons in their life. And this is definitely not an easy decision, and there's a lot of taboo around this as a topic. And this book is a memoir or part memoir by Harriet Brown. And she talks about the troubled relationship that she has with, or she had with her mother. And she also looks at the research around estrangement and conducted many interviews as part of writing this book. And I actually had Harriet on the podcast, and we talked about this. It was episode 2003, episode 203. And yeah, we talk about the fact that estrangement can happen on a continuum depending on how much contact or not contact that you have. We talk about sort of attachment and conditional versus unconditional parenting and early childhood experiences and how these can have an impact on sense of self and self-esteem for the rest of someone's life. We talked about forgiveness and what this actually means, and Harriet had done a lot of exploration in this area, so we go through that. And estrangement really is a topic that has come up a lot more in my practice this year, and so that was part of the reason why I read the book and part of the reason why I wanted to have Harriet on the podcast. But I do see that it does happen a lot for clients that have eating disorders, that there has been or is still a figure in their life that can be a parent or a relative that is having a detrimental effect, and they do really struggle with the decision of like how to navigate that relationship. So it's a again, not an easy book to read because it is quite saddening in parts, but it's if that is something that you're dealing with, I would highly recommend checking it out. And it's called Shadow Daughter by Harriet Brown. So yeah, those are the books that I wanted to recommend, the six. The other thing I wanted to mention, I do a lot of the evenings is I will play Sudoku. So I've got like a Sudoku book. So that's often something I'll do in bed. If I'm not reading in bed, I will do that. And I find that for me, it's a great way for my mind to settle, especially if I've been working late. So if I've finished up with a client call pretty late and I'm then kind of finishing that and really just getting straight into bed, I find that I need something to help me just wind down for the day. And sometimes playing some Sudoku as opposed to just reading something can be helpful for that. So that's something that I do. The next section then is documentaries. And so I watched 26 documentaries in total this year. And again, these will all be in the show notes. I've started to include documentary series in this list. I hadn't done that in previous years, but I did it this year just because they're coming up a lot more. And they're much more common, especially on Netflix, that there'll be a documentary series. And they were a large chunk of what I watched this year. So I wanted to include them as well because they can be incredible. And I didn't want to skip over them. So I'm going to talk about 6 documentaries. And for a couple of these, I've talked about them previously. So at the end of episodes, I make some recommendations of things that I've watched or consumed and want to pass on. And so some of these I have mentioned before, but I'm going to cover them again because I know that not everyone listens to every single episode. So the best documentary, or my favorite documentary for this year, was The Last Dance. And so this is a 10-part documentary series on Netflix, all about the Chicago Bulls, and it was from the late 80s through to most of the 90s, so looking at when they won 6 NBA titles, and a large focus of this was on Michael Jordan, who was the centerpiece and the superstar of that team. And this was just, an incredibly well put together documentary. There's so much great archive footage that they're able to use, like going back to when all these stars were in college. There's incredible interviews. They actually did interviews with each of them a number of times, and for subsequent interviews they would often show them a clip of what someone else has said to get their reaction. It just goes into so much detail. this was a really big part of my childhood, or it covered a big period of my childhood. So it brought up a lot of memories for me. And I'm not sure how I remember a lot of this, because I didn't actually watch much basketball when I was growing up. I was kind of into it, but I don't know how much of the NBA was being broadcast in Australia. So I don't know how I remember so much of this, but I do. It was great to get to see Michael Jordan interviewed for such a long time, because he is such an interesting person, like very supremely talented in what he did and what he was able to achieve. But you also get the sense that he's not the most likable or agreeable person, and great for winning championships. But outside of that, I don't know how much time I would want to spend around him. And so I would say that, like all good documentaries, if you're not into the topic at hand, you will still find it interesting. And this is definitely the case. Like, even if you have absolutely no interest in basketball, this is still fascinating to watch. I would say, look, those who are triggered by exercise and exercise leading to comparison, then this is probably one to avoid, because it's a lot of people playing a lot of basketball and training a lot. But otherwise, it is really fascinating. So the next documentary that I really enjoyed this year was called My Octopus Teacher. And I mentioned this, I think, probably a couple of months ago on the podcast. So I'd first heard about this through David Farrier, who is a New Zealand journalist and a documentarian, and he had created Tickled, which is one of my favorite documentaries of all time. So if you've never seen Tickled, I would highly recommend watching it, because it is just bizarre and has many twists and turns and is not what you're expecting. But I heard David Farrier interviewed and talking about how much he enjoyed this, and so I took note. And then a client also made a recommendation of it, and that kind of jogged my memory, and so I checked it out. And so it's the story of a South African guy who is also a documentary filmmaker, who's having a midlife crisis and is feeling burnt out, and he goes back to his home in South Africa and starts swimming in the sea, and finds that this sort of helps to assist with his mental health. And at some point while swimming in this new area, he discovers this octopus, and then he goes back the next day to see it again, and he then decides to take his camera and starts going back every day, and this then becomes the documentary about him developing this relationship with an octopus, which sounds strange when I say it out loud, and it is strange in parts. I was chatting with a friend about it recently who saw it, and he said it felt in moments like it was a spoof, like it was something from Saturday Night Live, because of how passionate he talks about the octopus. But it really is a beautiful story, and it's shot magnificently well, and it is stunning in that way. It's narrated well and edited well. It feels like one part David Attenborough style documentary, where you are learning about the wonders of the octopus life cycle that I never knew about, and the wonders of the sea, and definitely getting things on film that have never been caught on film before. And then it's like one part relationship story and about the guy's relationship with the octopus, and about the relationship he has with his son and his own life. I just found that this was a really sweet story and rather feel good, which definitely contrasts to a lot of the more darker stuff that I listen to and watch. It's called My Octopus Teacher and is on Netflix. The next documentary is called Hail Satan. And this was one that I think I've mentioned it before on the podcast, but way back in maybe the March or the April, May time. And I hadn't heard of it before, but I was scrolling on Netflix and it just came across the screen. And I'd heard a lot about the moral panic around Satanism in the 80s and early 90s, and that was kind of what I assumed that this was going to be about, but it turned out to be completely different. So it follows the rise and influence of the Satanic Temple in the US and how they're using the laws around religious freedom to push for the separation of church and state. And they're doing this by basically saying if you're going to put up a statue of the Ten Commandments on a government building, we want you to put up a statue from our religion, so a statue of Baphomet, because, it needs to be equal, that if you're going to have one religion up, we're going to have another. And while the name, the Satanic Temple, probably carries lots of negative connotations, they have 7 tenets, which for someone like myself, it's hard to disagree with. So tenet 1 is one should strive to act with compassion and empathy towards all creatures in accordance with reason. 2, the struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. 3, one's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. 4, the freedom of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forgo one's own. Number 5, beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. One should take care never to distort scientific facts to fit one's beliefs. Number 6, people are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify it and resolve any harm that might have been caused. And tenet 7, every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, and justice should always prevail over the written or spoken word. So, you might not have guessed that the Satanic Temple would have them as their tenets, but that is the tenets of that religion. So, I found this a really interesting documentary and worth a watch, and it's called Hail Satan. The next documentary is called 3 Identical Strangers. And it's the story of 3 identical twins who were separated at birth. And they then find themselves or find each other in their late teens when they go to college. So one of them turns up at college and people are calling him by a different name, and he's never been to the college before, and he's wondering why does everyone think he's called this other name, and then kind of figures out, or someone comes into his new dorm room and it kind of figures out that, hang on, this isn't the person we think it is, and then he gets met up with his identical twin brother, and this then becomes this big news story, and it goes into the newspaper, and then the third twin sees their pictures in the newspaper and is like, hang on, these are also my brothers, and meets up with them. And so these 3 twins who were separated, 3 triplets, who were separated at birth, then come back together, and they start living with one another and open a restaurant together, and it really just kind of follows their life and how things pan out. And it's a really great story in terms of looking at nurture versus nature. So one of them was put into a working class home, one of them was put into a middle class home, one was put into an upper class home. They had different parenting styles in these different homes, so looking at how that affected them. The film is then kind of an investigation into how this could happen. So how could 3 triplets be separated at birth, and each of the parents have no knowledge about it, and there's definitely some tragic elements as part of this film. It's a real exploration into human nature and as I said, nature versus nurture. So that's called 3 Identical Strangers. The next film or documentary is called The Social Dilemma, and I know I definitely talked about this recently on one of the podcasts, and I'd seen it on Netflix, but I kind of kept skipping over it. But then I kind of found out who the the documentary was made by and who was behind it, and that was Tristan Harris, and he is the founder of the Humane Technology, the company called Humane Technology, and I'd heard him on a number of podcasts before and loved what he had to share. I think he's a supremely intelligent human being with his heart squarely in the right place. And then I found out other people who were part of it in terms of like Gerald Lehner and Roger McNee and Jonathan Haidt. And so, yeah, I then decided that I wanted to check it out. And really the crux of the documentary is about how social media and the internet is reshaping our world and our minds, and not for the better. So the increase in fake news, in polarization, in anxiety, in teen suicide and teen self-harm, the rise of like populist movements and bad actors and bad states who are able to destabilize democracy and destabilize the very idea of truth. And I've listened to a lot of podcasts on this topic, so it wasn't a huge amount of new information, but I thought it was put together really, really well and got the point across well. And so if this is a new topic area, then it will be rather eye-opening. And so, yeah, I'm someone who is somewhat concerned about this. And obviously being a father and knowing how much technology has changed in just the last decade, to think that when Ramsey's going to be a teenager in another 10 years, what are things going to be like then? And I have no idea how things are going to turn out. And obviously the part of the documentary is really trying to push for things to change in terms of these technologies. And I've heard Tristan on podcast talking about how well the documentary is done in terms of watchers and reaching people. And so hopefully this does start to spur some changes on. But it definitely, for me, made me make changes in terms of how I use my own technology and removing certain apps from my phone and moving certain things to a further on page on my phone, and just being much more cognizant of things, turning off notifications, etc. So yeah, for me, I found it interesting, but also then quite practical, because I finished up watching it and instantly made some changes to help. So it's called The Social Dilemma, and it is on Netflix. And then the final documentary is called Feels Good Man. And I actually watched this on my birthday, which shows how much I love documentaries, although we were in lockdown, so there wasn't really many other options. And this is a documentary about, there's a comic character called Pepe the Frog, which was created, and it goes from just being a comic book and this comic book character to then merging into being this meme that starts to show up a lot. And then the meme really gets hijacked by the alt-right and starts to show up on 4chan and 8chan, and then gets marked as a hate symbol. And so Pepe the Frog becomes a hate symbol, and it's about the creator of Pepe the Frog really trying to get his character back. And this character was meant to be really fun-loving and definitely not associated with all of the things that it became associated with. And yeah, there was a lot in here that I didn't know about, or I'd heard about just in passing, in terms of 4chan and 8chan and what these message boards were, and how much these message boards had an impact on the 2016 election and getting Trump into government. And so, yeah, really quite eye-opening in terms of parts of the internet that I really didn't know very much about. And so, yeah, the documentary is, despite what I'm talking about, is quite sweet in parts. And there's just this guy who is an artist and a cartoonist and is very laid back, and just seeing his character turned into this hate symbol, and really it's then him trying to get it back and starting to sue different people and winning those cases. And yeah, I found it a really great documentary. So it's called Feels Good Man. So those were the documentaries for the year. Then the next category is podcasts. And I rarely listen to podcasts within the same niche that I'm working. So in terms of eating disorders and recovery and wellness space, like podcasts for me are about relaxation or about laughter or often, like many of the documentary choices, like hearing about the darker side of human nature, which is definitely the case of some of the recommendations I'm going to make. But yeah, most of the podcast listening that I do has nothing to do with work or is to do with work, but very tentatively because I'm interested in psychology, or I'm interested in something that someone's talking about on a podcast, but it's definitely not directly related. And in previous years, I think from nearly all of the years that I've done this show, I've mentioned revisionist history and also Making Sense, which used to be called Waking Up, as favorite podcasts. And I still listen to both of these, but there are others that I want to highlight this year. So the first podcast, and it feels strange saying that this is my favorite podcast of the year because of just how dark it is, but it was just done so well. It's called Hunting Warhead, and I listened to this at the fairly early part of 2020, and it has stuck with me the whole year. And it tells the story of the hunt by police and journalists for the people behind one of the biggest dark web online child abuse forums, and how the forum got taken down and taken over by the police. And so the police caught the person who was running it, and then took control of the site, but without any of the members of the site knowing that had happened. And they were wanting to keep it up as a way of trying to catch more people. And so it explores the ethics of this and how they made the decision to do this. But yeah, looks at the kind of investigative journalism and the rabbit holes that they would go down to try and understand what was going on. It's very harrowing because they actually, for one of the episodes, interview one of the guys, the guy who was running the site. And this is one of the most chilling things I've ever listened to, with him talking about what he'd done and showing no remorse and really kind of laughing about things and laughing about stuff that then came out later on in the court case that they hadn't known about. And so it goes without saying that this is incredibly full on and dark, but it really does show investigative journalism at its best. And I think that there is a lot more of this going on than people want to talk about or admit to, and it is a very taboo subject. But yeah, it did make me rethink about different relationships and rethink about things in the world. So yeah, if you have the stomach for this kind of thing, then this is very well put together, and it's called Hunting Warhead. The next one I want to recommend is called Rabbit Hole, and this is also rather dark, but not to the same degree as Hunting Warhead. And it's an 8-part series that was put together by the New York Times, and looking at what the internet is doing to us. And so there is a little bit of overlap here between Rabbit Hole and The Social Dilemma. They don't cover a lot of the same ground, but they're looking at the same general concepts. And so for some of the episodes, I think the first 3 episodes, they're looking at YouTube and the algorithm of YouTube and how that can lead people down rabbit holes and the impact that can have on someone. And they focus on a guy called Caleb, and he was someone who got into YouTube and then was watching it in a really obscene amount every day, like 8-10 hours a day. He was listening to it while he was asleep, and they had his watch history for 4 or 5 years and just go back through it and see how he is led down these different paths where he goes from someone who originally voted for Obama to someone who is then in these alt-right, right-wing extremist videos and very much watching that thing and believing in that thing, and then how he then shifts over to being on the left and very extreme left, and how that sequence happened through the different videos that he saw. It talks about the Swedish gamer called PewDiePie and how he amassed 100 million followers on YouTube, and he's someone who I had never even heard of, and yet he is got the highest number of followers on YouTube, or at least he did at the time that this podcast was recorded, and talking about the content that he was putting out and how it initially started as gaming and then morphed into something else. They talk about TikTok, and then the last couple episodes are looking at QAnon and conspiracy theories. And kind of like with Feels Good Man, the documentary, there was so much in here that I was just completely unaware of. And I've never been someone who spent much time on YouTube, or if I spend time on YouTube, it's because I'm going specifically to watch something that is of my choosing. So it's not that I go on and then start scrolling based on the recommendations and going down any of the rabbit holes. So there was a lot in here that I didn't know about, and it's by the New York Times, so it's really well put together. And yeah, I would highly recommend checking it out. The next one is Armchair Expert. And so this is a podcast that I discovered. I think it was recommended to me in late last year, so late 2019, and it was at some point in early 2020 that I started listening to it and just really, really got into it. So it's Armchair Expert. It's Dax Shepard. So Dax Shepard is an actor and a comedian. He's also married to Kristen Bell. And I find him just an incredible interviewer. So he is very, very intelligent and well-read and has a really wide range of knowledge, and highly rational. He has very high EQ, and someone who's done a lot of therapy and a lot of exploration around psychology and human nature, and he's struggled with addiction, so he's in AA, and so issues with alcohol and cocaine, and he's also then very, very smart, very, very funny. Sorry. So as a stand-up comedian or just a comedian, I think he was in the Growlings. So improv. So he's very, very quick, witted. So he has like all of these elements that for a lot of people that I listen to, they'll have one of these. Or may have two of these things, but they don't typically have all of them. And so he is just this really great mix. And one of the interesting things this year, obviously, because of the pandemic, so many podcasts that used to be done in person are now done via Zoom. So people like Mark Maron or people like Adam Buxton have had to then convert over to Zoom, and the same thing with Dax Shepard. So their podcast used to be recorded in person. And what is interesting is for most of the podcasts that I listen to, or pretty much all the podcasts I listen to, who've had to shift over to doing it via Zoom, there's been a real drop down in quality of their conversations, where it is much more stunted. It feels, less going with the flow. I can notice a real big difference that they're not in the room with that person, whereas with him, I cannot notice a difference. I don't know, because I've been listening to old episodes. I don't know which ones are via Zoom and which ones aren't. And I think that is a real credit to him and his ability as an interviewer. There can be some focus on exercise. There can be sort of objectifying comments that he makes, typically in jest. He probably has issues around body image and food himself. I mean, he lives in LA and he's a celebrity, so it kind of is par for the course. So yeah, with those kind of warnings out there, it is still a very good listen. And I probably listened to, I don't know, 40, 50 episodes this year. And so it is a bit of a blur in terms of what to recommend, because I've enjoyed so many of them. But the ones that stick out to me, Will Ferrell, I remember just laughing hysterically for the majority of the interview. I thought that was done very well. Kristen Bell, the first episode he did of the podcast is him with his wife, Kristen Bell, and it's the first half an hour is basically them having an argument, which sounds strange, but is actually, is interesting to listen to, and kind of gives a bit of an insight into a lot of the therapy that they've done together as a couple, and his ability to talk to people. There's a great interview that he did with Monica Lewinsky, which I found was fascinating, and obviously know a little about her, but I hadn't really heard her talk in an interview. I'd seen her TED talk, but hadn't heard anything apart from that. So I thought that was great. And then he did a recent episode called Day 7, which was about him having a relapse recently, which was. He's someone who is just so calm and funny and just always feels totally at ease when he is interviewing people. And as someone who's then listened to so many episodes like that, to hear him on this Day 7 where he's talking about the relapse and all the things as part of that, and you could just kind of hear the tension that is there. And if you hadn't listened to any of his other episodes and Day 7 was the first, you might not notice it, but for someone who is a regular listener, you could really notice it, and you could just sort of hear the authenticity that was there. So yeah, Armchair Expert is definitely the thing that I've listened to the most of anything this year, and I really do highly recommend it. And I have a lot of envy of him as an interviewer, because I think he is an incredible interviewer. So the next this is just a single episode of a podcast that I listen to, and it's the podcast is called Reply All, and it's episode 158, The Case of the Missing Hit. And so this was recommended to me by my sister. She and I are both into music. She works in the music industry, and it's an episode about a guy who remembers this song from his youth. So I think he must be in his mid-30s, and he's driving home, and he starts kind of humming this song and then singing this song, and his partner, she's like, I don't remember this. I don't even know this song. And so he then goes and tries to look it up on the internet and types in some of the lyrics, expecting it to come up, and just nothing comes up. And he just has this thing now as an earworm just ticking over in his mind. He's remembering more and more of the lyrics and more of the melody and the different instruments that comes in. And so he just goes on this mission to try and find this song. And he hires session musicians to recreate the song, and then he takes it around to music execs to see if they can remember the song or point him in the right direction. And for me, as someone who loves music, this was like a great thriller or like a murder mystery of like trying to figure out what was going on here. And so yeah, it's just absolutely fascinating that someone can remember so much of a song from so long ago that they're not actually sure if it even really exists. And this guy then has this moment of starting to think like, have I made all of this up? So I highly recommend checking it out. It's a really fascinating episode. It's Reply All, episode 158, The Case of the Missing Hit. And then the final episode I'm going to mention, and again, this is just a single episode, and I have mentioned this previously on one of my other podcasts, and it's a Tim Ferriss episode. and it's episode 464, and it's my healing journey after childhood abuse. And so Tim Ferriss is really the first podcast I got into in a big way, and I was just kind of in awe of being able to listen to long-form interviews and hearing celebrities. And yeah, for a number of years, I kind of listened to everything that he was putting out. Over time, I started to find it a little bit frustrating and found his interviewing style a bit frustrating. So now it's something I only very occasionally listen to if I'm really interested in hearing a particular guest. But this one really grabbed me because I saw it come through my emails, and it wasn't about a particular guest, but it was about Tim opening up about childhood sexual abuse that he had suffered. And it's really about him talking about the last 4 or 5 or 6 years since he's discovered the trauma, and him kind of dealing with it, and the various healing modalities that is used as part of this. And the podcast is him talking to Debbie Millman, who is someone who'd been on the podcast with him before, who is a writer and a designer and a brand consultant, and she has her own podcast called Design Matters. But she had also experienced abuse as a child, and has been in therapy for that for the past 3 decades. And there's lots and lots of links that are made as part of that episode. And if you actually go to the episode on Tim's website, there's just a ton of different links and resources. And I found this really useful because, like, one, I think this is a subject that's not talked about very much. Like, there is a huge amount of shame around it, and it's just so hidden away. And Tim has such a huge platform, and for him to be speaking up about this issue, I thought was great, and it will hopefully start to make a bit of a dent in things and make a change. And I'd say the same with Dak Shepard. He is someone who has experienced childhood abuse, and he is very open about talking about it, and I think that's great to hear. What I also really liked about this episode is both Tim and Debbie have had very different experiences with healing, and have taken very different approaches. So Tim has been much more drawn to the non-verbal therapies and psychedelics, which explains why he's been so involved in promoting research around this and donating large sums of money, like in the millions, to Johns Hopkins as part of research. And then Debbie's taken more of a talk therapy or a traditional approach, where she's been doing this consistently for every week for decades. And so, as I said, in the episode, there's many references to books and documentaries and modalities that are helpful. And yeah, I have recommended this to a number of clients who've had similar experiences, and they found the episode to be really useful for them. So I do highly recommend checking it out. And so that was episode 464, My Healing Journey After Childhood Abuse, and that's Tim Ferriss's the Tim Ferriss Show. So that's it for the podcast. So music is the final category here. So it's been a bit of a weird year for me with music. Like, when I look at my Spotify account, I haven't added much new stuff. So when I'm listening to stuff on Spotify, I'll then just create a playlist, even if it's just the album as a playlist. And when I look through, I haven't added a huge amount this year, but I have been constantly listening to music because it's what I do when I work. So I probably spent a lot of time just listening to the Discover Weekly feature on Spotify. So it just kind of refreshes every week, and there's then 3 hours of new music. A lot of artists or all artists have had large chunks of this year or majority of this year. And this is still the case where they haven't been able to play. And so there's been lots of live streams, that have been put on, and so I think that has also taken up a lot of my listening for this year. So some of the things that come to mind in terms of what I listen to. So Boiler Room does lots of electronic music and DJing that they broadcast, and so they had a thing this year, and I'm not sure if it's still going on. It probably is. It's called Boiler Room from Isolation, and so it would be people DJing from their home or from a location where they're on their own, and so yeah, I've been listening to a lot of these, and the two that I listened to the most was Job C. And then Dixon. So both of those Boiler Room from Isolations have had lots and lots of plays for me this year, and they're both on YouTube. John Digweed is a DJ that I first got into back in the mid-90s and was someone that I listened to for quite a while, and then probably the last, I don't know, decade, I haven't really listened to very much of his stuff. But when the lockdown started, he started doing, he called them bunker sessions, where he would play from his studio or room in his house. And yeah, every week was playing for 2 or 3 or 5 hours. And yeah, I really enjoyed them, and he was playing music that would be sort of new music, but also stuff going back to the early 90s and mid 90s, and so yeah, that was a real enjoyable thing, and would be something I'd listen to as the new one came out every single week. So yeah, that they've probably been the electronic music I've listened to the most this year. I discovered a band called Neutral Milk Hotel, which I found through Spotify recommendations. I think they came up in some of the playlists in terms of just the Discover Weekly feature, and I'm not sure how I missed this band. So these are a band from the late 90s, and it's definitely stuff that I would have been into when I was at school if I had discovered them, but for some reason I just missed them. And they have an album called In the Aeroplane Over the Sea, which yeah, I listened to a lot this year, and so that was one of the new things that I discovered from a very long time ago. Same with Elliott Smith. So Elliott Smith, some of his music started to appear in my Discover Weekly feature, and there's a song called Needle in the Hay, and when it came on, I was really kind of racking my brain thinking, why do I know this song so well? And then kind of Googled it, and it's used in The Royal Tenenbaums, which is one of my favorite films. I then also discovered that he had a lot of his music on the Good Will Hunting soundtrack. So again, it's another musician from the mid-90s that I kind of was obviously vaguely aware of, but really didn't know his name. I'd only kind of heard his songs in films, and so went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with him. Discovered that he had died from suicide. I actually watched a documentary about him called Heaven Adores You, and so yeah, I listened to a fair bit of his music this year, and then the last couple of months. And again, I don't know how this came about, but I started listening to some of the Flight of the Conchords. So Flight of the Conchords is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. So they are 2 New Zealand actors, musicians who had a TV show on HBO. I think they had 2 seasons. One was in 2007, one was in 2009, somewhere around there. And they just do like spoof songs, and so the TV show was about them 2 New Zealand musicians who were in a band and living in New York, and the shows would be about them trying to get gigs and play gigs, and they would, as part of each of the shows, have 2 or 3 or 4 parody songs as part of it. But what was great about them is they are very good musicians, but they are also very, very funny. And so they did a live show in London in 2018 that was recorded, and that is on Spotify. And I actually remember watching the show on a flight once. And yeah, when I then discovered on Spotify, I just started listening to it again, and I've just been listening to it a lot on repeat. As I said, it kind of sounds weird that they're like spoof parody songs, but the musicianship is really high, and it's very enjoyable. So that has been taking up a lot of my listening recently. So that is it for the music, and that is it for this week's episode. They are the things that I've been listening to and watching and consuming and reading over the last year. As always with these episodes, I'd love to hear your feedback. So what have been your favorite books and documentaries and podcasts and music from this year? Or you can tell me other categories, so favorite films or favorite games or whatever else you've loved this year. You can email info@7-health.com, and I would love to hear what's been kind of doing it for you this year. And I always actually like this part of doing this podcast, because I typically get back recommendations that I can then check out. So that is it for this week's show. I will be back next week, and I will catch you then.